Well, I'm really excited to be here today. My plan is not just to tell you a little bit about some of my research, but actually to make a broader case for the practical value of economic theory as game changer, okay, as a tool for helping us to better understand and brainstorm solutions to a wide variety of pressing problems, and not just what you might think. Okay, so the first half of the talk I'll be talking about what economics is, so the scope of economic theory. And in the second part, I'll discuss two specific examples of important strategic problems that for a long time people thought had no solution, but which economic theory specifically can be credited with coming up with a novel idea to completely change the game and solve the underlying problem. Okay, so first though, what is economics? Well, to find out, before I get to that, most people nowadays understand that economics is about more than just what you learn in Econ 101. It's more than just supply and demand. And a lot of the credit for that goes to this book, Freakonomics, a bestseller from 2005, which focused on the diverse research interests of University of Chicago professor Stephen Levitt. Okay, so this book features sort of a dazzling variety of applications, everything from sumo wrestling to the internal organization of urban gangs. Okay. Nonetheless, Freakonomics only really scratches the surface of what economics is about because, naturally, it focused on the research interests of one guy. Okay, and Stephen Levitt's research, broadly speaking, you can think of as falling into the categories of what I would call economic measurement and individual incentives. So for example, if you read the book, you probably remember the chapter where Levitt makes the case that the dramatic drop in violent crime in the 1990s is at least partly due to the rise in abortions in the 1970s. Okay, it's a very controversial argument. That's an example of economic measurement. Okay? Or you might remember the chapter where he talks about sumo wrestling. And he predicts that sumo wrestlers will be more likely to cheat in the last match of each sumo tournament. Okay, and that would be an example of individual incentives. Okay, but there's relatively little in Freakonomics on the third big branch of economic theory, which is the study of strategic interactions. Okay, so-called game theory. And I wrote my book, Game Changer. This is the part where I hold it up, Bill. To fill that void. Okay, so this is a book about strategic interactions with its own, wide variety of applications, everything from antibiotic resistance to violence in sport and organized crime. But even Game Changer only hints at the full scope of economic theory because it turns out I focus in the book on just one type of strategic interaction, the game called the prisoner's dilemma. Okay, so what is the full scope of economics? Okay, so this is where I went to Wikipedia for the answer. And here's what they said. In economics, agents are assumed to act rationally. That is, to have a stable preferences, an overall guiding objective, and the capability of making a choice. Now, you might not be surprised to learn that that's dead wrong. That's not what economics is about. In fact, many of the greatest achievements of economic theory have been in helping us understand why people behave irrationally. Okay? We do not assume rational behavior in economics. I'll explain more in a second. That said, the domain of rational decision making is important in economics. So it's worth thinking first about what it means to be rational. And here, the Wikipedia does a good job. And I focus on the words guiding objective, because that's really what rationality is all about from an economics point of view. You have an objective. You have a goal in life. And your choices are guided by that objective. You're pursuing it. If that's true of you, then you're rational. It doesn't matter what your goal is. Okay? Now, but are people rational? And many are skeptical. Here's the philosopher Bertrand Russell. He wrote, "It has been said that man is a rational animal. All my life I have been searching for evidence which could support this," suggesting he never found it. Okay? And we also know that real-world decision-making is remarkably subtle. There's a lot going on. For one thing, non-conscious influences certainly matter. Our own Gavin Fitzsimmons wrote on his webpage, he says, "My collaborators and I have shown a wide array of situations in which consumers are guided by non-conscious influences. In addition, people make lots of mistakes. Okay, so this is our own Dan Ariely from his book, Predictably Irrational, where he writes, "We consistently overpay, underestimate, and procrastinate, and these misguided behaviors are systematic and predictable, making us predictably irrational." But what does rationality really mean? Okay, so this is where I'm going to dig into this. And I'm going to start with an example from Dan's book. So he did an experiment, a really interesting experiment, where he had a huge bowl of Starburst candies. Do you know them? They're the little squares. Okay, so colorful squares. And people would walk by this public space, and there were two treatments. In the first treatment, he had a sign that said, "As many Starburst candies as you want, they're only 1 penny each." Okay, and then they took notes of like how many people stopped by, how many they bought. And then later, he put up a sign that said, "Starburst candy, they're free. Take as many as you want." And the surprising finding was when they were free, people took less. Now in economics 101, I mean, we all learn that there's demand curves are downward sloping, right? So when the price goes down, more people buy. It's irrational to take less when it's free, right? Or is it? Is taking less stuff when it's free? Now it might be surprising, but is it consistent with a guiding objective? Could you, when put in that same situation, take less when it's free? Anyone? Would you all just take the whole? I mean, let's get down to it. They should have taken the whole bowl, right? If it's free, why not just grab the whole thing and take it home? That was legal. No one did it. They're all irrational. Would you take the whole bowl? Why not? What's your objective in not taking the bowl? What? Greedy. If he takes the whole bowl, people might see him. Okay, so you care about what other people think about you. Others, yeah? Oh, it could be like poison. This could be like some weird sadistic trick. It could be your candid camera. There's something wrong here. It doesn't feel right, okay? What? Okay, there's many. We could have a fun conversation for 20 minutes coming up with 10 different types of reasons why a person could very rationally choose to take less. Okay, but they all have to do with what we would call non-financial motives, and many of them have to do with social motives. They have to do with the fact that there are other people there. Okay, so this is actually not irrational. In fact, it's a great example of rationality, that people care more about money, okay, and they can be guided by more than just money. That said, not all behavior is rational. And in fact, Kenneth Arrow, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, as far back as 1951, wrote in his classic paper, Social Choice and Individual Values. Here's what he found. He found that even if individuals are rational, there's no way for them to act as a group where the group itself will behave rationally. Because many times groups have to make choices together. And if you on the outside just saw that group and you viewed it as the decision maker, it's going to have incoherent behavior. Okay, so the group will not be rational. Okay, so this was a great insight, one in the Nobel Prize. Organizations can be irrational, one of the most important ideas in economics. And then this guy, Richard Thaler, had a natural extension of that idea. He said, you know what? I've been reading a lot of psychology, and an insight in psychology is that people themselves can be viewed as organizations. This is kind of obvious with people with multiple personality disorder. Okay, but all of us actually have multiple selves. In a sense, we have our current self and our future self. Okay, have you ever tied your hands to kind of force yourself to do something in the future? Okay, you're playing a game with yourself. There's also evidence that even in the present, we have a deliberative and an impulsive self, if you will. Okay, so we are organizations, and that can give us insight into why we behave irrationally, why we may not have a coherent objective, or why we may actively pursue things that hurt ourselves. Okay, so all those things are real, but they are inconsistent with economic rationality. What about cognitive limitations? These are not inconsistent. In fact, much of the most exciting research in economic theory today, and here I give a plug for my colleague Todd Sarver in the Duke Econ department, is in economic theory when there are cognitive limitations of various kinds. And this research goes all the way back to Herbert Simon's administrative behavior in 1947. So for many decades, economists have understood people have limitations in how they make choices, and this can generate systematic biases, incorrect beliefs, et cetera, it's heuristics, all consistent and even predicted, in some sense, by economic theory. So, but that is consistent with rationality. You ever seen the movie Memento? Okay, that guy forgets whatever happened like 10 seconds before, right? He's still rational. He's doing the best he can. He writes all the notes down, on his hands. Okay, that's rational but limited. He's making all sorts of mistakes. He's being tricked in all sorts of ways, but he's rational despite his cognitive limitation. Okay? What about these non-conscious influences? Also perfectly consistent with rationality. And here I'm going to quote a paper by our own Tanya Chartrand titled Non-Conscious Goal Pursuit. And in this paper, Tanya talks about how a wide variety of behaviors can be sort of non-conscious, but they are learned within social contexts, and therefore they're triggered. Your behaviors are triggered by your environment. You don't necessarily think about it, but they are learned, and they are in the pursuit of an objective. Okay, so they are rational, because they are in the pursuit of an objective. You don't have to be conscious to be rational. In fact, you don't have to even be a human to be rational. You don't even have to have a brain, as long as you have an objective and it guides your behavior. Okay, so whether you're talking about ants, bacteria, or even computer programs, it's meaningful to talk about the economics of these things. And in fact, a lot of the areas of my more applied, I'm a theorist, but also these applied interests, are in applications specifically in these things. So if you read the book, you'll learn about bacterial resistance. You'll learn about a novel way to destroy biofilms. Online fraud, I'll talk about that today. And other things I'm thinking about more recently are a novel way to destroy viruses, cure viral diseases, and ways to detect and defeat cyber attacks. Okay, so these are all applications. And I'm going to talk today about the online fraud thing. So this is the scope of economics. Okay, so it's huge. All right. Now the second part of the talk, so there's a wide variety of situations then that economic ideas can be helpful. I'm going to now get specific and talk about two particular applications where there was a problem. It appears on the face of it to be completely insolvable. Okay, so for each one, I'm going to lay it out for you, and you'll agree there's no way to solve it. And then we solve it based on an idea that can specifically be credited to economic theory. So someone actually sat down and said, let's think about this with economics, came up with the idea. Okay? First example is catching cartels. So business cartels, not the Mexican drug cartels. Catching that's much safer. I don't get into the drug cartel catching business. So this is not mine anyway, although Leslie Marks is a world leader on this topic, and she wrote kind of the papers describing the vitamin zinc. So throughout the 1980s, the US Department of Justice, this is amazing, has the job of catching cartels, did not catch a single cartel throughout the whole decade, and the early 90s as well. Okay, like little ones they might have. Why? Well, you might hope that it was because there were no cartels active at the time. However, they actually caught a lot of them in the late 90s because they changed the game. So we know that wasn't true. It's just we could not catch them. And the reason is simple. They don't want to be caught. Okay, so as long as they're not stupid, they're never going to be found. I mean, they could be very unlucky, so stupid or unlucky. So here's an example of one of the biggest ones that's been caught so far. They called themselves Vitamin Zinc, and they made the bulk vitamins that are fed to farm animals, that are put in your cereal box, like those sort of things, not the ones you eat as a pill. Okay, Vitamin Zinc. What did they do? Senior executives met secretly once per year, so at one of their houses or at some hotel somewhere, and they decided on the prices and how much quantity would be sent to each country around the world. They destroyed all records and notes of the meetings. Okay, it was cause for termination if anyone found out that you took a note away, that you would be fired. And they developed a bona fide sort of sense of camaraderie, fellow feeling. They actually felt they were on the same team. Okay, playing against the customer, basically. And they even went so far as to lie under oath. This fellow Kuno Sommer actually lied under oath, went to jail, never spilled the beans on anybody else. After he got out of jail, he got a plum job as a CEO, okay, in the same industry. Okay, so very effective at keeping themselves secret. So clearly, no way to solve this problem. I mean, they failed for more than a decade. There's nothing you can do, right? Wrong. So let's think about this from an economic theory point of view. So they're playing a game. So Hoffmann-La Roche, one of the players, has to decide whether to confess or not confess. Everyone else in the cartel has to decide confess or not confess. Now, I've written the payoffs, if you will, here in terms of jail time. Just okay. So the worst case for you is if the other guy confesses and you don't, like 3 jail bars. So if the others are confessing, you prefer to confess. The problem is that if no one else is confessing, you don't want to confess, because if you do confess, you might still get in trouble. I mean, you did a crime, okay? So you might still go to jail or get in trouble. As long as no one is confessing, no one wants to confess. So there's actually 2 equilibria, if you will, one where everyone confesses, one where no one confesses, and this is where we were stuck, okay? So that's the essence of the problem. Also, I should just note, I emphasize this in the Board of Visitors because many of them were executives. This is not to say that the top executives even knew what was going on. Many cartels are mid-level executives colluding amongst themselves. When the firm itself finds out, well, what would you do if you were the top executive and you learned the mid-level executive was breaking the law? You would tell them to stop, but then you would keep it quiet. You wouldn't then go say, hey, and by the way, we broke the law this year. Okay, so that's what happened. But all that changed dramatically starting in 1993. DOJ introduced a new program that what it did is it offered complete immunity, but only to the first firm that confessed. So now, if you discover that one of your employees has been breaking the law with others, what are you going to do? You're the top man, you're the legal department. Confess, confess. If one of them does it first, we're going to jail. We got to confess now. Okay, so as soon as one firm found out about its own misbehavior, it would immediately confess it. So whereas before you would never know the cartel was there, now it gets caught. Okay, so that immunity complete. Now how can we think about that in the game theory thing? Well, we're changing the payoff in that box where you confess and they don't. Previously there was 1 jail bar, now it's get out of jail free card, which is even better than a very small chance you might go to jail. Okay, so you've changed the game. You've created what's called a dominant strategy to confess. And now everyone goes to jail, basically. And here's Scott Hammond, who was the head of the Antitrust Division for a long time. He explains the advent of leniency programs has completely transformed the way that we detect cartels. The notion of letting hardcore cartel participants escape punishment was unsettling. It goes against the whole nature of being a prosecutor to let people go. But they understood the case from economic theory that you had to give full immunity for this thing to work. Okay, so it was economics that convinced them to adopt this program. All right, so that's the first, and I'll finish with a second example, which actually is a chapter in the book. Okay, so this is on online marketplace fraud. And I'm going to give you the idea, which has not yet been implemented. But I hope to convince you that there is a problem, seems completely unsolvable, but if you do what I'm suggesting, we will completely solve the problem. Okay, so that's sort of what I'm going to lay out. So eBay founded with this wonderful mission statement to create an open market that encourages honest dealings to make it easier to conduct business with strangers over the internet. Okay, but when you put the word stranger and internet in the same sentence, there's all sorts of problems. In particular, there's the risk of fraud. Has anyone been the victim of fraud? Okay, online fraud, yeah. So it's a problem. There are criminals out there. And eBay has this thing called reputation or feedback scores. But for a long time, it's been understood by people who use eBay a lot that these feedback scores don't mean very much. Here's a quote from way back in 2007 from an eBay user in a post called, "Can You Still Trust eBay Feedback?" And he says, in the past, the feedback made it easy to avoid the online scammers. Just only deal with people with lots of positive feedback. However, the scammers have now figured out ways to give themselves false positive feedback. They'll buy stuff from themselves and say, wow, that was great delivery. It never happened. It was fictitious. Okay, so And they explain for a very small amount of money, you can give yourself a glowing history. Okay, so this creates the opportunity for fraud. But when we're thinking about how to solve the problem of fraud on a site like eBay, you have to understand it's actually a two-sided problem. And anything you do to solve one side could make the other side worse. Okay, so on the one hand, you have the buyer fraudsters, and then you have the seller fraudsters. Seller fraud can take many forms. For example, there's identity theft. That's where the criminal convinces you to give them like your credit card info or your personal info, not through the sanctioned eBay channel, okay? And then they like steal your identity or they charge your card. There's also failure to deliver, which is kind of self-explanatory, and product not as described, which is a little more pernicious. Like you order something and it's not quite what you ordered. What do you do now? Okay? And then there's feedback suppression, which is when you're thinking about giving the seller negative feedback, and the seller says to you, if you do that, I'm going to destroy you. I'm going to give you really bad feedback. I'm going to say you are a buyer fraudster. Okay, I'm going to ruin you if you ruin me. So some buyers are fearful to give negative feedback if the sellers can, quote, retaliate. Then there's other examples on the buyer side. So return fraud. Imagine if you're a seller, you send the buyer a perfectly good bobblehead. And then they send you back a broken one and say it was broken. They'd keep the good one. They'd give you back the broken one. What can you do? Okay, they're returning something different than what you sent them. That's an example of return fraud. There's also feedback extortion. So this is where that buyer does that, and then they pay you $100 for something, you send it to them, and then they write you an email saying, hey, this isn't what I expected. You better send me $20 back, otherwise I will give you a negative. Okay, it's perfectly fine. They just want that $20. They want to extort you. Okay, so that's called buyer extortion or feedback extortion. Okay, and this all happens. Now, eBay understood the problem of seller fraud. It was hearing from its buyers. And so what eBay did in 2008, 2009 is it tried to solve the problem of seller fraud by removing the seller's ability to do feedback suppression. Okay, so nowadays, sellers are not allowed to say the buyer was bad. They're not allowed to. Okay, and buyers loved it at the time. So one buyer wrote on a discussion board, good move for eBay, finally a smart move. Okay, but sellers didn't feel the same way. Here's what one seller wrote. This move is horrible for honest sellers. There's no shortage of unethical buyers out there who will make false damage claims or state that the wrong item was sent, item was missing, etc. With the new policy, unethical buyers can blackmail the seller into getting what they want. Okay, so they made the problem of buyer fraud potentially worse, while not even solving the problem of seller fraud. Because sellers can still go out and buy themselves a nice reputation score. Okay, so sellers have other avenues to still defraud you. Okay, so they've made the problem worse. Okay, and thinking about it, there seems to be no way to solve this problem because it's an anonymous system. Whatever system you put in place, reputation-wise, cheater sellers can work around it, figure out how to break the system. Okay, so it seems like there's no possible way to solve the problem. But here's, I will give you a solution, but first we got to think about the economics of the situation. And so fraud on a site like eBay is what we economists call a hidden information problem. Okay, so there's a bit of information that one side has that the other side doesn't have. Okay, and in this case, the information is simply, am I a crook? I know that. You don't know that. That's hidden information. Okay, hidden information arises in lots of situations, but this is a real simple one. Okay, so am I a crook or not? This is sort of the veil of ignorance, if you will. And you're sitting on that side, okay, as a seller, as the buyer, I mean. Okay, so how do we solve hidden information problems? Economic theory tells us there's two basic ways. There's really only two ways. One is to get on the opposite side of the veil of ignorance. Just learn it. Figure it out yourself. Investigate. Okay? Find the truth. And this is what the feedback system was supposed to do. Because if feedback is genuine, then previous buyers' feedback will be a true report on the experience they had. Okay, so that would solve the problem. You now will only deal with honest sellers. You'll avoid the crooks. Okay, but we've already seen the feedback system is manipulable. Okay, so there'll always be some doubt. Is this a really good seller or a guy who's somehow made it look like he's good? So we're going to still be behind the veil of ignorance. There's another solution, though, which we call signaling. And the idea here is to give that seller a choice. You can choose A or you can choose B. Okay? And if we can somehow create a choice so that the honest seller chooses A and the crook chooses B, like imagine we could do that. You give them a choice, the honest guy chooses A, the bad guy chooses B. You see what they choose. So now you only deal with people who chose A. Okay, so in principle it makes sense, right? Of course, the trick is coming up with a choice because the crook will always want to pretend. Okay, so that's the essence of it. So we have to think of a choice that the crook will not want to make, but the seller won't mind doing it. And that's the essence of the idea. So here's the idea. There may be more than one way to do this, but here's my particular idea. I call it extra assurance. And the idea is that eBay could add a little toggle, just one little thing on every sale, and the seller decides, do I want to offer extra assurance or not? It's a choice the seller makes. And what is extra assurance? It is, it basically provides some additional service to the buyer. And here's what it is. First of all, when you buy something, your money is held in escrow, okay, until you get it. That's sort of already kind of true, but that's important. So the seller won't get paid until you have the chance to return the item. And the important thing is there's a no questions asked return option. Okay, so if you get this thing for any reason whatsoever, you can send it back, get a refund of your purchase price. However, you are going to have to pay the shipping cost, two-way. Okay, and the reason I do that is for various reasons, but one is, it's to stop you from like ordering 100 pairs of shoes and sending 99 back. Okay, so you won't do that if you have to pay the shipping cost. Okay. Now, if you can prove fraud, you can still go through what eBay calls the buyer protection program. If you can prove to eBay that you got defrauded, they'll give you everything back, including shipping. But this extra assurance program covers those tricky situations in which you can't prove fraud happened, but it did. Okay? So why is this important? Why would this work? First, let's think about what you would, as a crook. Okay, if I'm a crook and I send you a product not as described, what's going to happen? You're going to send it back. I'm never going to get paid. I get zero. I will never offer extra assurance, no matter how much business I lose, if I'm a crook. Okay, that's the whole point of this thing. At the same time, if I'm an honest seller, I will occasionally get returns, but the buyer will pay the shipping cost. So it's going to minimize the cost to me. Okay, so it's minimal cost program if I'm honest, maximal cost program if I'm a cheat. So we can expect separation. And once buyers learn about this, they will choose extra assurance. They will demand extra assurance. And crooks will be driven away from the eBay marketplace. Okay, so hasn't happened yet. Hopefully someone will read the book. Actually, I sent the book, the chapter to people at eBay, and it was interesting. They said, well, as I know some guys in the eBay research group, and they said, well, David, you got our attention. But they couldn't tell me anything else. And reading between the lines, they didn't give me any feedback. Reading between the lines, I believe they probably showed it to their legal department. There's a lot of examples of actual frauds happening on eBay right now in the book. So they probably didn't like me for this chapter. But hopefully they'll take some ideas from it and solve the problem of online fraud. Thank you.